Introducing Machon to you is, well, quite a long story, but I will keep it short. Machon has been an officer in the war on drugs. That's why we invited her to speak on this subject. She has been a former intelligence officer for MI5, the UK Security Service, and served in counter-terrorist and counter-drugs operations in Northern Ireland.
I was also very moved watching that film just before the meeting started. These children who are suffering incredibly and then given medical marijuana and then they cease to suffer. They are, can live a normal life. And it reminds me of some of the other work that's going on, or people are trying to do, certainly in Europe, where because we have the war on drugs, because we have legal prohibition, scientists cannot do their job effectively. People like Professor David Nutt in the UK, who's trying to investigate things like the antidepressive qualities of magic mushrooms, or the post-traumatic stress help that something like MDMA can give, is finding it incredibly difficult just to do his basic job as a scientist, to get the material, to get permission to do his job to investigate the potential benefits of these drugs. Pharmaceutical companies seem to be okay getting permission to make all sorts of very toxic drugs, but when it comes to these sort of so-called illegal drugs under the UN conventions, we are still in a blind alley. But as it was said in the introduction, I used to work as a British intelligence officer. I was very involved in the 1990s looking at Irish terrorism, particularly with responsibility for the logistics of Irish terrorism at the height of the civil war in Northern Ireland, when the provisional IRA was letting bombs off at will on UK streets. So my job was to try and track how weapons and people could move into the UK and out of the UK to commit these crimes. That meant that I did a lot of work with the UK Customs Service, and particularly their investigations division. And I became very aware even then, 20 years ago, that the war on drugs had failed. The Customs knew the war on drugs had failed. They basically said it was like looking for a needle in a haystack, trying to interdict drugs coming into what was an island country. So on the mainland Europe, with porous borders, it's even more impossible to try and stop the free flow of drugs into any country or any community. In fact, even in the UK, with the high security prisons, they are finding it very easy to get whatever drug they want, even within this so-called hermetically sealed environment. That is how failed this model of prohibition has become. But what I want to talk to you about, and I'm very conscious that tonight is focusing on the issue of cannabis, and I think that Belgium has made great strides in normalising the use, and I really salute the idea of cannabis social clubs here and in the Netherlands and in Spain, and even quite sort of covertly in the UK. I think it's a fantastic way forward to allow people to cultivate what they need and to remove the profit motive from the organised crime side of things. I realise there has been some pushback from the police in this country, which is unfortunate, but hopefully LEAP can help try and change the tone. So as you said, I represent LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. We are a fairly new organisation, only 12 years old, which was founded by 5 police officers in the US way back in 2002. And in those 12 years, we've grown globally. We now have over 100,000 supporters around the world. We have a representation in 120 countries, and we are getting representation and traction at national level government hearings around these issues, because of course, coming from law enforcement, having worked in that field, for us to say that prohibition has failed, the war on drugs has failed, is actually rather an alarming message. And we say this not only because we've seen the harm in our communities, on the streets. I mean, we consist of a range of law enforcement professionals, both police and judges and lawyers and even drug czars and prison governors, so the whole spectrum of law enforcement. So we know the damage, not that drugs have done, but the damage that the war on drugs has done to our communities and to our countries, and even to whole regions of the world. So what I want to do tonight is just pull back from the specific discussion around cannabis and give you a sort of macro political picture of the harm that the war on drugs has done over the last 50 years. And of course our politicians always talk as if drugs are evil, and the war on drugs and prohibition is an immutable reality, like a law of physics. It's not. The war on drugs has only been in existence since 1961, effectively, where the first UN convention was put in place because of pressure coming from the US. It was re-ratified in 1971, in 1988, and again in 2012. It was re-ratified again at the UN, where they said, we will have to fight the war on drugs and continue it because we will win in the end. And the aim of the war on drugs is to eradicate the use of drugs around the world. So I just want to give you a few facts and figures from my colleagues in the US to kick off, because the US is the fountainhead of this war on drugs. And since the 1960s, if we were winning this war, you would think that some indicators would show that we were indeed winning. But in the US itself, there are probably 7 key indicators to show whether or not we're winning this fight. The first one would be that the supply of drugs decreases. And these are stats just from the USA. In the USA, seizures now by law enforcement from the 1960s were in kilograms. Now they are in tons or hundreds of tons. So the supply is not decreasing. The second indicator would be that purity would decrease on street drugs, because of course it's harder to get them, it's harder to grow them, it's harder to transport them. But in the USA alone, from the 1960s, street heroin would have a purity of 1.5%. Now it has a purity getting on for 60%. The other indicator would be that the price of street drugs would decrease. Of course, because you're eradicating the drugs and trade. Again, in the US, the price of cocaine has, would increase, and it has decreased now from the 60s by 60%. The price of heroin from the 1960s to now has decreased by 70%. That means there is more of it out there, and it's more easily accessible. We would also say that the use of drugs would decrease in the US. In the 1960s, 4 million people were known to be users, even recreational users. That was 2% of the population. Now we're looking at 121 million people in the US have admitted using drugs at some point. That is over half their population. One other indicator is that overdose deaths would decrease. Again, 1960s, 1 in 100,000 people would die of an overdose in the US. Now it's 10 in 100,000 people die in the US every year from a drug overdose. Then the other indicator is violence and murder would decrease. Well, I mean, you just have to look at the US. I don't think that's the case. Not only is street violence and gang violence increased exponentially, but also the number of deaths of police have gone back up to the level they only last achieved during alcohol prohibition in the 1920s, when organised crime fought over its turf then. And the final indicator from the USA is that drug arrests would decrease because fewer people would be using drugs because we're winning the war on drugs. 1965, 65,000 people were arrested for drug possession. 2005, 1.9 million American citizens were arrested for drug possession. Overall, in the last 50 years, 46 million Americans have been arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated for drug crimes. Most of them, the vast majority of them, just possession and just minor. And this is just the USA. Admittedly, probably the biggest consumer country in the world of illicit drugs. But that's just one country, which has been brutalized and divided and criminalized whole swathes of their population because of this failed war on drugs. But it's not just the consumer countries like that. As I said, I worked in counterterrorism, and one of the things that became very obvious was not just that the war on drugs had failed, but it was also the fact there was a huge overlap between organised crime and the drug trade and terrorist groups. Certainly many of the Northern Irish terrorist organisations received much of their funding from the illegal drug trade. And we continue to see this to this day across the world. So the DEA in the USA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, estimates that over half the currently designated terrorist organisations around the planet receive most of their funding from the illegal drug trade. So think about it logically. We have a situation where we the UN enforces prohibition, drives the illegal drug trade underground, which provides massive profits, up to possibly $500 billion per year, not only into the pockets of organised crime cartels, but also funds directly a large number of terrorist groups around the planet. So we have this perfect cyclical business model that the war on drugs then funds terrorist groups, and then we fight the war on terror. It is the perfect business model, logically, for the military-industrial complex, but perhaps not so good for the rest of us. And to give you a couple of examples, Afghanistan, since they have been liberated and had democracy given to them, since the West's invasion 10 years ago, the acreage under growth for the opium poppy has doubled across the country. And in some areas, and particularly the ones that were protected by the British Army, it has trebled. And they have had a bumper crop this year. They produce 90% of the world's heroin. So the West is there protecting and fighting the war on terror, and yet the drug trade has exponentially increased. The same happens in Colombia, where there's been an insurgency for the last 40 years with a group called FARC, a terrorist organization officially. They receive about $300 million per year from the cocaine trade. I mean, it's just crazy. And where does all this money go? Of course, it has to be laundered somewhere. So then, of course, we get the corruption of our financial institutions. For example, the Bank of Wachovia a decade ago was caught out money laundering. And were there prosecutions? No, there was a small fine, and then it got discreetly absorbed by a bigger American bank, Wells Fargo. Nobody was ever held to account. Nobody was held and put on trial. There was no justice achieved. Only a couple of years ago, a big British bank, HSBC, was caught out having knowingly laundered almost $1 trillion of Mexican drug money. What did they get? A slap on the wrist. $1.9 billion fine. Nobody prosecuted, nobody held to account. Now, the scale of this corruption of our financial institutions is such that in 2009, the head of the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, a man called Antonio Maria Costa at the time, said that in the financial crash of 2008, if it had not been for the grey and black market drug money going through the banks, many of our big Western banks would have had no liquidity after the financial crash. It was the criminal money that kept them afloat. How can this be acceptable? What we have now, because of the last 50 years of prohibition, is the biggest global crime wave we have ever seen, with an annual drug trade worth up to $500 billion per year, going into the hands of violent criminals and terrorists. How is this achieving a drug-free world? How is this protecting our communities and our children? It is not, it's exacerbating the problem. Now, of course, nothing is all black. Nothing is all bad. There are many initiatives of harm reduction, particularly in Europe, which have been very successful. Not least, of course, the Dutch coffee shop model, or the Portuguese decriminalisation experiment, which started over a decade ago, where all drugs are decriminalised, so all users are not made criminals for ingesting the drug of their choice. And before that law passed, there were apocalyptic warnings from all the political classes saying, this is going to be terrible. We will become a magnet for drug tourists. Our youth will be corrupted. Addiction will go up. Crime will go up. It's going to be appalling. And yet, even Portugal, a conservative country, voted it through because they wanted to protect their children, their local communities. And it's been a resounding success. By decriminalising all drugs in Portugal, crime has gone down, drug use has gone down, particularly amongst the youth, the 15 to 24 age demographic. There has been no drug tourism. The health benefits have increased because, of course, people are no longer frightened to go and ask for health intervention if they develop problems. It has been a win-win, at least for the user community and for the wider community around them. However, from the LEAP perspective, harm reduction is one half of the argument. We would also suggest, though, that we need to look at the bigger globalized picture. Because it's not just about the users, it's not just about the communities, it's also about the impact of the global drug trade, not just on our consumer countries in Europe and North America. It's also the harm that is created by the illegal drug trade in the producer countries like Afghanistan or like Latin America. And also, let's not forget the poor transit countries where the drugs have to be moved from Latin America, say, up into Europe or up into America. Mexico is the biggest transit country for North America. It has seen a massive increase in violence since the Mexican government, on the say-so of the US government, started to crack down on that trade 7 years ago. In that time, over 70,000 innocent people have been caught in the crossfire of this drug war in Mexico, in the most gruesome ways. And in North Africa now, which is one of the new big drug transit routes from Latin America into Europe, we've seen whole nation-states descend into anarchy. Countries like Mali, or Guinea-Bissau, or Libya now, since we liberated the grateful Libyans from the jackboot of Colonel Gaddafi, they have descended into narco states where whole regions are controlled by the drug cartel, the drug lords, who, particularly in those areas, tend to be very, very similar or overlapping with the terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, Al-Qaeda in Libya. The militarized militias are seizing control of the drug routes through their countries. So again, we are funding terrorists by fighting the war on drugs across great swathes of North Africa. And also for Libya as well, the unfortunate country, drug use has gone up as well, exponentially since Gaddafi was deposed. And I'm not a Gaddafi apologist, he was an odious dictator, but at least they had stability. Now with this new flow of drugs through the country, drug use has gone up hugely. Heroin use has gone up hugely. And of course, all the associated problems with it, including HIV infection, have gone up massively. So the transit countries are affected by prohibition hugely. The producer countries have been attacked and invaded and subverted massively by the US for the last 50 years. And the producer countries as well have seen an increase in violence, increase in drug use, and an increase in prison populations because of this prohibition. So things are improving in Europe with the harm reduction policies. Things even in America, the fountainhead, are beginning to improve. For example, in the states of Washington and Colorado, where they have legalized all use of cannabis, even just for fun. I mean, crying out loud, fun? How dare they? But there are also 22 states that have legalized medicinal marijuana as well. So the US now surely is going to have to begin to let go of its stranglehold on the war on drugs. And it is. The two countries now that are beginning to be the strong men in this argument are Russia and, strangely, Canada. There will always be someone trying to enforce it. But I think the times are changing. And I think that now, one other aspect from my counter-terrorism world, I would suggest, is that the US and other Western countries don't necessarily need the war on drugs anymore. They've had it for 50 years. It was a fabulous excuse to invade, to subvert, to mess with, to generally go into and cause problems of countries of strategic trade and political interest, like Latin America, like the Middle East, like Africa. They don't need it so much now because they got a new toy to play with, which is the war on terror since 9/11, which gives them a much better excuse to invade other countries, to drone bomb other countries, to assassinate people, and to shred our civil liberties in our own countries. So I've got a feeling, I think give it 10, 15 years, the war on drugs will go. And we just need to keep pushing away, mainly I think with the harm reduction in our countries, so that users are not criminalised. But also to be aware, to remember the vast societal, countrywide, region-wide harm that is done in many other countries that produce and transit these substances. So, move is afoot. If you're interested in LEAP work, there is a new publication. The website is just leap, leap.cc. And because we have a bunch of lawyers and judges in our organisation, we've picked apart the UN conventions. And we've said there is a very easy way to amend them to finish these old conventions. So if you want to go to the website, it's the proposed amendment for the UN drug treaties. Very simple suggestions, thought through and worked on by lawyers. It's not radical, but it's solid. And this can be used with politicians. This is not some radical manifesto. This is a legal document. So please have a look at that. Please support LEAP. And all I can say is I hope that the cannabis social clubs in Belgium and in other countries across Europe are allowed to continue to thrive, because that is the very first and very important step towards harm reduction. And that, I think, is the very first small step to end the failed 50-year experiment of drug prohibition around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Annie.